Hi, this is Paul. I'm trying to catch up on some of my YouTube watching backlog, or at least YouTube listening backlog. And so, two videos I wanted to get at this morning were the Education on the Battlefront, Jordan Hall and Annie Crawford on Gray Hamilton's channel, and on John Heer's channel, his conversation with Paul Kingsnorth. The title came first, and it might be that YouTube now lets me try some A/B titles, so I've got a couple titles in mind. But the title is sort of "God Bless Young Christians on YouTube," because as I said in the video that I released this morning, which isn't performing terribly well, which I kind of like because that gives me permission to release another video today, which I love making videos and I love releasing videos. And so, I release more videos than I should for YouTube. I know this. Someone, if I had a YouTube coach that'd say, we really want to get your sub numbers up. We really want to get your view numbers up. Produce better videos less often. And it would be like, or at least don't make so many crappy videos. And it'd be like, yeah, but I like making crappy videos. So which one to talk about first? Because my overwhelming impression of what's going on here is this cycle between deinstitutionalization and reinstitutionalization. And this is part of what happens when you have a lot of new Christians coming into the church. And it's a tremendously exciting time because those new Christians tend to reinvent the wheel. And the Christian wheel has been reinvented for like 2,000 years. We keep doing it. But every time we do it, we take a little bit of the old and something of the new. And part of what's always so refreshing about new Christians coming in, and, two new Christians, very prominent new Christians on YouTube, who are Jordan Hall and Paul Kingsnorth. Every time you have these new Christians coming on, and these are very smart, very capable men who have achieved a degree of worldly success and prominence and attention. Both of them had a degree of attention before they sort of ever infiltrated our corner or our corners or our groups. And they bring that status into our groups, which gives them a degree of status within our groups. But they come in with fresh eyes. And they come in with fresh thoughts. And they also come in with a worldly formation that they bring into the church that helps sort of revitalize aspects of the church to reintegrate a lot of what's been going on out in the world that the church has sort of kept siloed out. Now, part of the tremendous irony of this is especially the orthodox. Because as I listen to this conversation between John and Paul, and there's all of this enthusiasm about orthodoxy, this is in many ways really both a deinstitutionalization and a reinstitutionalization of orthodoxy. So let's go to this one first.
And the other thing we've lost, but which is also interestingly coming back, is pilgrimage, which is part of the same thing.
Right.
We had monasteries everywhere, but as you say, most people were not monks and nuns. But if you look at, say, England, where I come from, or Ireland, where I live, there is a huge network of ancient pilgrim paths there. I mean, England, Canterbury in England was one of the greatest pilgrim sites in Europe, obviously. There's obviously the pilgrimage to Rome, there's the pilgrimage to Santiago, but there are many, many, many smaller pilgrim routes to places that, even here in Ireland.
Now, you can go to someone like Richard Rowland, who made the observation, Protestants have icons. At Calvin Seminary, when I was a security guard, this is before I was a student at Calvin Seminary, we had to patrol the seminary building because it was part of college campus. And there were these pictures of past, like 19th, early 20th century professors. And these were black and white pictures. These dudes, they'd often have long beards. They'd look sort of creepy. They're dressed in different clothing. And I remember some of the security guards would just kind of get the jitters walking through there because it was like something from a 1960s or 70s horror movie where the eyes sort of seemed to find you and to follow you. And it was, but those are icons of sorts in an iconoclastic tradition. And you have pilgrimages of sorts. People will go to Wheaton College to the C.S. Lewis Library. Was that a recorded conversation or an unrecorded conversation? I don't know. I know a lot of you complain, well, there's not as many randos coming out. The truth is, a lot of my randos conversations are unrecorded because they're much more pastoral, and a lot of the randos conversations with women especially are unrecorded because women... the male-female thing on YouTube is different for men and women often. So I found this so interesting because clearly the movement to pilgrimage, the movement to holy places, he talks about, well, let's have him do some more talking.
So many little islands on locks that people used to make pilgrimages to, and they often used to come from the other side of Europe. So this notion of, you take time out of your life and you walk to a holy place, and the walk is part of the journey. You don't just fly there and, jump off and then fly home again. You walk and you make a spiritual journey in the middle of your ordinary life, and then you go back again. And everyone has to do that. Interestingly, obviously in Islam, they have to make the Hajj once in their lives. So there's still a kind of central thing. And again, in Western Christianity, it's a thing that we've just let fade away. Yeah. But it is interesting that I've noticed more and more books.
What we haven't, well, let's see, what has faded away and what hasn't, because that's the key. Because people still do these things, and they do these things as Protestants, they do these things as Catholics, they do these things as atheists. You can go to they do these things as nationalists. You can go to the Freedom Trail in Boston. What is the Freedom Trail in Boston? The Freedom Trail in Boston is a pilgrimage. And you can have tours at the pilgrimage. How is that pilgrimage institutionalized, and towards what? That is really the main question. And when you have all of these, let's say, implicit Protestant holy sites and pilgrimages, and on the Friday live stream, I was basically making the point that if you look at something like Youth with a Mission, that's a Protestant monastery, okay? That's a Protestant monastery. And it was interesting because Jordan Hall in this video is sort of
to an ecclesial structure that presumptively jettisoned that responsibility as part of its core responsibility in life. That's a really big deal. That's a real serious issue. So the reintegration of that is the rediscovery, for example, of the megachurch is topologically impossible because it does not embody relationality. Okay, figure number 2. God told us to be fruitful and multiply. Those words go together. In fact, the Hebrew is more properly be fruitful, and therefore, as a consequence, you will notice and discover that you have multiplied.
Okay, let's talk about that a little bit. Because he's right. And multiplication follows fruitfulness. And this is exactly what we see happening in this video with online orthodoxy. And when I say online orthodoxy, I'm not slamming it at all. I'm just saying there was a video that was released a few days ago with a Greek Orthodox priest complaining that they were live streaming their baptisms, their infant baptisms on YouTube. And now I assume, as I've seen on other previous clips, sometimes the Orthodox baptize babies by dunking them briefly, and the babies are naked. Of course, well, why not? It's just a baby. They could be naked. It's non-sexualized. But YouTube had been taking those videos down and weren't allowing them to post those videos. And this Orthodox priest was complaining about this is religious persecution on the part of YouTube. Well, it's like, well, and then someone in the comment section, said, but it's what they're all the rest of your videos are up there. What their relevance realization is focusing on is the fact that the baby has no clothes. And what the YouTube is focusing on is that they don't want to have any exposure at all to pedophiles or anything like that. So as a policy, now this word police is going to be the word that we're going to be wrestling with as we go into for a long time now. They have a policy, a policing. They have a policing of non-consensual nudity, and obviously the baby is too young to consent, and so the baby is nude, and so it's non-consensual nudity, and so therefore it's just easier for YouTube to police and have this policy to not let any of those videos on. And this particular Greek Orthodox parish was complaining about the fact that YouTube would not let them do it. Now, of course, they could probably have a private server and let the members of their church watch it, or they could find some other ways, but YouTube is easy and they just want YouTube to continue to. It's sort of like the conversation around ads on YouTube. It's like, well, there shouldn't be any ads on YouTube. Oh, really? So all that bandwidth, all that storage, all that stuff, they should give it for free? I'd love it if they'd give it for free. I'd love the world to be given for free, but YouTube isn't giving it out for free. YouTube is going to put ads on this stuff, and the longer we go on YouTube, the more ads are going to get played. I can promise you that, because that is the crapification of the internet cycle that continues to go around and around and around. Anyway, where was I going with this? It's about the administration. So Jordan Hall is basically talking about the fact that I should just probably put these in the same. There we go. Jordan Hall is talking about the fact that Gray had talked about the fact that, well, if you go to a church over 500 people, you might not even know the pastor. If you go to a mega church, the pastor might not know you, and on and on and on and on. And this is why I say, God bless the young Christians, because those of us who've been working in the church world for a long time, we know all these dimensions and we know the trade-offs. And even just in my 60 years on this planet, plus reading that I've done in past centuries, but even just my 30, 40, 50, because, I started doing ministry in my father's church long ago, not preaching or anything like, but teaching Sunday school and teaching summer camp and vacation Bible school. And, when you're often in the minister's family, you get recruited, you get voluntold pretty early on. They didn't do much volunteering, but so I've been working in churches my whole life, and there's all of these trade-offs that are involved. And so Jordan's talking about these scripts.
Emphasis on fruitfulness.
Oh, yeah, we're talking about the fruitfulness. The irony with the monasteries. Someone goes out into the wilderness to be alone with God. They're seeking solitude. They're looking for mortification. They're going to just wear simple vestments. Seraphim Rose, actually, not Seraphim Rose, but Seraphim Roland. Richard Rowland. I have trouble with when people change their names, and I have trouble when people change their names for religious reasons, and I have trouble for people that change their names for supposedly non-religious reasons that really are religious reasons. It's just always hard keeping track of people's changed names. But he just had a little post on Twitter about this with respect to vestments. So they go out into the wilderness, and everyone is inspired and impressed at their mortification. And so what do? And it's the Forrest Gump scene where Forrest Gump goes, I said this on the Friday live stream, goes running back and forth across the country. Everybody is impressed at this demonstration of virtue, the old sense of the word virtue. This man is jogging back and forth across America. So lots of people start emulating him. They too. And they don't know why they're emulating him. They just are, because they are tremendously impressed with this. And they assume that if someone goes on a bender or is just simply hedonistic and self-indulgent, nobody is impressed by that, because everybody understands it, because they say, of course I want to eat everything I want. Of course I want to have all of my vices unshackled. Of course I want to give way to my desires and let all of them go. Of course I want that. But when someone restrains their desires and embraces rigor and decides to do self-mortification and goes and lives in a cave and just prays all the time, everybody's like, Well, they must be getting something out of that. It's the same development that if you're in a crowd and everybody's eyes go someplace, you look exactly where they do. You just naturally do. And it's a good thing to do. It's not a dumb thing to do. And then what happens is people are, or at least a percentage of people, are tremendously impressed by that act of virtue, that act of self-mortification, that act of heroism, that they want to emulate it. And they discover some of the benefits that kept the other person doing it. And before you know it, you have a movement. So fruitfulness has brought multiplication. Now, the yeah, but I have on that point is, let's say, the beginning of the book of Exodus, where Israel has been multiplying greatly. But what's interesting is it's not because of their fruitfulness in terms of their obedience to the Lord, because they've forgotten his name. They don't know who he is. All they're doing is suffering, but yet they are thriving and they are multiplying. And now with all of these current debates about population collapse and what's involved in that, someone could easily find some sort of evolutionary or psychological reason for that. No problem. But what Jordan says here about fruitfulness and multiplication is very true. And that then leads to the kinds of problems that all three of them are complaining about. And what I have seen in the last, my whole life, but even just in the last somewhat 30 years, when I've been paying, almost 30 years, when I've been paying close attention to American missiology, their complaints, their critiques, they've all been engaged at one level or another. That now, I am not saying or complaining about their complaining. I want to be very clear about that. Because their engagement and their complaint and their desire for better, their desire for more, their desire for renewal, we could use that word and everybody says, renewal, that's a good thing. Their desire for reformation, worried about that word, is good. And it's by this kind of energy that the church gets renewed and renewed and renewed, and it's changes, and then those changes bring questions, because some of the renewals that come in as a consequence of this kind of renewed desire for rigor and sacrifice and energy in the church lead to other unintended consequences that are externalities that the church doesn't quite know what to do with. And then another generation comes along and does the same thing. And at the same time, people wish that we could just keep hold of the original. If you haven't watched my absolutely wonderful conversation with Father Greason, you should. Because that's what this is all about. So Father Greason, so I find that this Cane Ridge, I was just looking at the map, and is Cane Ridge near where we're going to have South Estuary? I might want to go to Cane Ridge. Why? I'm not from Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ. I'm not from that Stone Campbell movement at all, but I'm curious about it. I'm curious about it because my friend in Southern California, Mark D. Parker, is very interested about it. And Mark S., who wrote that great little hymn that is without accompaniment, I thought about that when I was thinking about this. What Daniel Greason and I are talking about in this video is the ongoing life of the church. Now, I know a lot of people are, when they think about orthodoxy, they think about the icons, and they think about the liturgy, because that's all sort of salient and new for a lot of people, because they didn't get that. They didn't see that before. And so they're all geeked about that. I don't think this Orthodox moment we're seeing now is fundamentally about the theology or the icons or the liturgy. And I'm not saying those things don't make contributions for individuals and their reasons to pursue the Orthodox Church. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying fundamentally what's happening with the Orthodox Church in America is part of this cycle of taking apart institutions and putting them back together again. Because if you look at this whole question about pilgrimage, which they're not talking about institutionalization at all.
coming out about pilgrimage now, pilgrim routes reopening and things. And often it's in a sort of secular guise, but then it also is sort of a disguise for something spiritual that people don't really even know how to talk about.
Yeah.
So that is, that's such a big thing. I'm more and more interested in that. That's the way that we can go to these places and bring them back to where we are.
Can I share something that happened that I think is a fractal of what you're saying?
And it's a funny story. John's always funny. But the point is, what is orthodoxy doing now? And this is something that people who are very anti-institutional are doing without recognizing this is institutionalization. Others who are deeply desirous for, again, less chaos, more structure. If you look at, let's say, Rafe Kelly's story with respect to, let's go a little bit earlier, what Jordan was talking about.
Priest.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's just it, when you're saying that, I'm like, there's the position my think of the relevant scripture at it. It's like, well, exactly. Me, but that's same trust to me. There's the gap. About radical, like always, kids are going to feel like they even realistically have the authority in your individual. And you
okay, we're going to start
just listening to them on Sunday morning.
We're going to start with what Gray was saying. Oh, now
point, Jordan. One really difficult thing, touching on the megachurch thing or the size. It doesn't have to be a megachurch for there to be almost no relationship between the pastor, the leaders that you're talking about, and the people listening to them on Sunday morning. And that is the, in discussing this with some of our community and people, I try to gauge, it's hard. It's really hard because most people who hear what they heard at our church 2 weeks ago on Sunday morning do not have the reaction I had. And so then in trying to communicate my feelings about it, it's very difficult because I don't want people, it's just a hard thing to navigate. But the point I've really tried to push on and touch on is, if you are not in the C.S. Lewis inner ring of, it's crazy. Even at churches, there are inner rings. If you are not in the inner ring of a church that has, I'm going to throw an arbitrary number, more than 500 people or whatever. Once you get beyond that number, if you are not in that inner ring, which means you're either on staff, best friends with somebody who's on staff, et cetera, grew up with the pastor, you don't have a relationship with that person. And you probably don't even have a relationship with one of his first couple deputies or whatever, such that that person is going to feel like they even realistically have the authority in your individual life to say something as personal as, you probably shouldn't have your kid in that public school or that private school. And you probably should, that, the confidence to do that, even the most confident, brazen pastor, and our pastor's awesome. I really trust him, and he will say, he's very, he will say it. He'll say what he thinks. But there is a line.
Do I have stories about pastors who are willing to speak into and not willing to speak into people's lives? And again, what's fascinating is that across the spectrum, so it's so interesting because orthodoxy is so visible on the internet, certain people will say, these Orthodox pastors speak as ones with authority. And it's have you ever met a Pentecostal pastor? Have you ever met a Black Pentecostal pastor or a Hispanic Pentecostal pastor? Many of these pastors are, I remember there's a very large church in Sacramento that is fairly well known. Pastor is quite famous, and everybody in church was afraid of this pastor because this pastor had absolutely no compulsions about speaking into other people's lives. I've told the story about a parachurch Pentecostal ministry where this young couple, they're all excited about the ministry. They're really into it. It's about dream interpretation. The Holy Spirit is speaking through it. They're really excited about it. And so then what often happens with these ministries or these parachurch ministries is that the top leadership will keep an eye out for the people who are most enthusiastic about that ministry, most willing to sacrifice for that ministry. And if you show yourself most enthusiastic and most willing to sacrifice for that ministry, you will get sort of fast-tracked up into the inner circles. And now, would I do the same dynamics happen in the TLC? Yes, they are nearly inevitable. And even though part of me really hates them, it's always living with these kinds of dynamics that are really difficult. So in they go, they're volunteering, they've relocated, they've changed jobs, they've changed locations, they are at the core of this ministry. And the leader of this parachurch ministry was a direct descendant of a famous Civil War general who fought on the South, and so he had all of that. Yeah, all of that, and a very famous. It was a descendant of Stonewall Jackson, and who was a character of monumental proportions. Just look at some of the stuff about Stonewall Jackson. But and so at some point he said to one of the women, he said, your marriage would be better if you'd lose some weight. Now, is it possible that the marriage could have been better if she had lost some weight? Sure, it's possible. Might not also be true. But he certainly had no pause in terms of speaking with authority. And I have seen all my life certain pastors speak with authority into people's lives. And sometimes it's like a bolt from the blue and it's fruitful. And then when it's fruitful, everybody's just sort of in awe of this pastor and they really want to be around. And this pastor is, until the pastor does it and it goes terribly wrong. And this is part of the reason that when you are invested, whether by a formal institution like a denomination, or even by, let's say, a non-denominational, part of the reason you have this proliferation of non-denominational churches is to a degree because of the dynamics inherent within this conversation here. And it's in some ways easier to grow your church large being non-denominational because you don't have all this pesky supervision. So then the other side comes around and says, oh no, we want apostolic succession. We want a way to sort of, in our imaginary, guarantee that there's been a laying on of hands all the way down from the apostles, that one-to-one these people have been discipled, and therefore the living tradition is maintained. What's super interesting, though, is how all of these are mechanisms, whether done in writing or done in community, for trying to maintain a living tradition and trying to, it's almost like trying to put time in a bottle, trying to put the Spirit in a bottle. And you can swing the other way and say the Spirit can't be put in a bottle, it's free, and that's true. But it also doesn't mean that with good practice, with good discipline, with submission, with all of these other good things that all can be abused, you're not going to necessarily guarantee it. And this is life in this age. It simply is. And so,
beyond which I don't
so he's talking about the fact that, well, how's the pastor supposed to know?
It applies. Which
on the pyre here. First, Annie's version of it. Did you say bitterness and there were other
Grieved.
grieved? Yeah,
So Annie was frustrated because their homeschool co-op wanted a larger space in which to meet. Let's talk about this cycle of institution, shall we? Because I have lived at almost every level of this cycle. Just had, for example, a Fijian and a pastor, and usually whose English was rough, a Fijian immigrant. So he's bringing from Fiji the real stuff, and that's gathering a church around him of Fijian immigrants. But with him is someone slightly more capable, has been in America longer, his English is better, probably has a little bit of money. He's sort of the He's sort of the number two in the church, and the church is 20, 30 people. And they're right here in this neighborhood, because this neighborhood is filled with immigrants from all over the world. It has been for a very long time. And they've been meeting in homes. And what they've recognized is that in a house, most of the houses around here are sort of 3-bed, 1.5 bath, or maybe a bigger house might be, and they're a little bigger sometimes. Well, there's housing question, but they're meeting in a house, they're meeting in a backyard, and what happens with the house church? Well, neighbors complain because they play music, and they meet on Sunday evenings, and a lot of the rest of the people just want to go to bed early because they've got to get up and work the next morning because they're hardworking immigrants and people. And so the house church thing, and then whoever's hosting the house church thing, who has to prep the house for the service, and who has to clean up after the service, and how much toll does that put on that bathroom, and is there food, and what's happening with the child care, and part of what happens when you, let's say, have a staged ministry, whether it's orthodoxy where you have the icons and the iconostasis and the in and out and official people, yada, 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 or you have sort of much more informal ministry, is that you're always dealing with who talks and who stays silent. And those who talking, what do they say? You're always managing all of these things. And now, again, I've worked with churches in the hills in the Dominican Republic that are 6 to 10 people, larger churches, 30 to 50, 100 people, denominations, groups of, let's say, there are about 1,000 people in my zone in the Dominican Republic. I've worked with small, mid-sized, larger churches. I was with my church in Grand Rapids when it went like from 250 to 1,000. The people who hated that growth most were a lot of the people who were there from the beginning. And when we go to Chicago and people are like, why are there 2 Christian Reformed churches and they're just like 2 blocks apart? It's like, oh, that's because of some peculiarities within the Christian Reformed Church. Because all of these issues, and ones that are particular to time and space, constraints we can call them, are common. So Annie would like her homeschool group to meet. And, well, you've got some churches that aren't too willing to share the space. Well, why? Well, maybe they don't have a janitor. Maybe it's the pastor that has to open the door all the time. And the pastor used to live right next door to the church. But the pastor moved away from being right next door to the church, because when the pastor lives next door to the church, anytime anyone needs anything, they knock on the pastor's door. And whereas the pastor should be doing all of the holy things like everybody thinks the pastor should be doing, like praying and studying scripture and preparing his sermons, there's these great little poems out there about what the perfect pastor does. The perfect pastor spends 100% of his time discipling people, and 100% of his time visiting the sick, and 100% of his time visiting the prisoner, and 100% of his time praying, and 100% of his time studying the word, and 100% of his time doing evangelism. And 100% of the time keeping a great family. And the reality is, with the constraints of a real human being, choices have to be made. And I praise God that Annie and her group found a church that was willing to host them. But truth be told, their little homeschool collective, and again, we homeschooled. We participated in various different homeschool groups. I mean, my wife and I have done a lot. And found a church that would host them for $1,000 a year or so. I think that's what she said, which is basically probably cleaning fees. But now we are living within a machine. And one of the first things that happens, if you have a church of any size that has enough for a facility, even for these little churches that we rent to, the Fijians haven't gotten back to me. I don't know that they will, because I already moved the Nigerians around so we'd have room for the Fijians. Well, what are you doing? Why can't the Nigerians worship whenever and wherever they want? Well, because there are actually things like parking lots and doors and HVAC systems and all of these things. And part of the reason that the Nigerians are here and not in a house, well, for one thing, their music is loud. And you might think, wow, these Pentecostal Nigerians, no, they're Anglican. But when you listen to their music is some Anglican hymns, some Nigerian songs, and some American praise and worship songs, and then some things that are really hard to categorize. And even though there's only 15 or 20 of them in a tiny little room where the acoustics are actually quite good, they still put up a big speaker and blast it out there. And they like doing solos, and they have processions, and they are, if you would just look at them, if I didn't tell you they're Anglican, some Sundays you say, oh yeah, they're definitely Anglican. Other Sundays they'd say, oh, they're evangelical. Other Sundays they'd say, oh, they're Pentecostal. They're all of those things, those Nigerians. And the pastor and his wife is like the first lady, and his sons are often like schlepping the sound system around when you don't really need a sound system, and the keyboard, and the pastor is also the worship leader because he likes to play on the keyboard and sing. This is life in a real church. And so a group comes along and says, we'd like to use your facility. Great. And so like the Fijians come along, and great. And Livingstone's can use some little bit extra rent. So we've been limiting the number of groups that we rented the space to, because in the past we've had child care centers, we've had neighborhood associations, we've had town hall meetings, we've had homeless shelter. In the years that I've been here, we have used this facility for almost every conceivable purpose, including certain individuals have lived here unofficially for years on end. So a group comes, and the first thing you say is, does your group have insurance? Why would the church ask about that? Well, because the church has insurance. And every time I have my little insurance audit from the insurance agency, I was, well, wait, we shouldn't be insuring ourselves with secular agency. Actually, this one insurance company basically insures almost all the churches in America. Oh. And one of the things that they'll ask are, tell me about your children's ministry. What is happening when children are on your site? Well, why do you ask? Well, because we're concerned with child safety. Well, child safety is important. Well, what does child safety require? And some of you know this because you've run children's ministries in churches before. Because you have all of these policies, all of these policing, trying to keep the children safe from strangers. Now, if the children are abused in their own home, the insurance company of the church doesn't care. But if somebody else's child is abused on a church property, now the insurance company cares, because when the police get involved, and if a lawsuit gets filed, that insurance company is there. Well, churches shouldn't have insurance. And they're probably not going to have a building at some point. Or nobody's going to want to work for that church because the pastor knows whatever happens with a lawsuit is going to go after anyone who has money that's connected to it. So there's that whole liability angle. Then you just have the pettiness angle. We have rented to all sorts of churches over the years and have seen all sorts of behavior. Some of it wonderful, some of it terrible. There's one pastor who actually is in a church across the way, was quite backed by his Pentecostal society, who at some point about 4 or 5 years into here, I convinced the council to have a policy at church to no longer give keys to people who rented, which added more work for me because I'm always opening and closing. But it also meant that you don't come to church and discover, oh, 200 people are here at the facility using it, and I had no idea that they were. And they're using everything in the kitchen, and they're using the sound system, and they're going to leave a mess. And Sunday morning when you come in, you discover that, holy cow, everything is moved around, nothing is in place, all the chairs are moved, garbage has been left in the sanctuary, ants are getting at it, we're starting to have a roach problem. In other words, there's a world of things you think, well, Christians wouldn't do that. One of the funny things is that the city solid waste kicked out all of the businesses, and we as a church were designated as a business. So suddenly we no longer had city garbage, and this church produces hardly any garbage each week, unless there's a potluck, and then we produce more. So then I had to go out and get a private garbage contractor. Also, when we had city garbage, first we had the garbage can that everything went into, and then we had recycling. And then we had yard waste. And you very quickly learn that a tiny segment of Americans even aspire to recycling policies in terms of what to put in one can or what to put in another. Even just a per person aspire. And there are huge segments of the populations, including immigrants, including poorer people down on the spectrum, people of all different categories that just don't really have the patience to decide what can to put things in. So I just had one can because it's like, it doesn't matter what color my cans are. Everything's just going to go in the one can. And we don't make that much garbage, so we have one can. And of course, we had to put up the fence because we had all this illegal dumping. And so contractors who didn't want to pay the dump to dump their things would dump the stuff on our property. Then I had to go. And so then I get a note from the city that you need to also have a recycle can. Really? Yeah, you do. Why? Because that's our policy. Oh, okay. So I'm doing ministry within this machine. So then it basically doubles our garbage cost. One of our deacons was like, how much do we pay to do garbage? I said, yeah. Why can we cut that? I said, probably not, because the city requires these things. Oh. So then we have a recycle can. And what's funny is that the garbage can is black right now, and the recycle can is green. And because one of our elderly people and his disabled son are now too elderly and too disabled to actually do the bad job of cutting the grass that they used to do, I got a great rate from some landscapers. And they're pretty much all immigrant or second generation here in the States, and they do a great job. They're great to work with. They're wonderful, lovely people. But you know where they put the green waste? In the green can, which waste management doesn't really appreciate. And when the Nigerian church has a big fellowship eating, and they've got all their other Anglican churches in, because we've got one of the facilities that has a little bit more space than the others, and they all come in and they have a big meal and they do all that. Where does all the garbage go? Well, once the black can fills up, they fill up the green can. And it's like, and these are tiny little things. And if you look at my office, I am not a guy who is bothered by chaos or mess or distraction. I'm really not. I am so easygoing. Some of you have an indication of that. But not everyone is as easygoing as I am in a church. And some of those people are in leadership in a church. And they're much more into order rather than chaos. And they say, why don't our renters, or the other people using our facility, follow the rules? And then what happens is you get a lot of signs up in the church. Sign, everywhere a sign. Signs by the thermostats, signs by the garbage, signs in the kitchen, signs everywhere that say how things should go. And I always, inside, I watch these things go. I watch them happen, and I say nothing. Because I'm not going to fight these lovely, orderly people that say, oh, these other people using our facility, they're good people. But they're kind of a mess, and they don't show up on time, and they don't leave on time, ever, because they're from another culture, another country. So if we just put a sign up, that will solve it. And I say nothing. Because I know, because I've lived all my life. I'm a third culture person. I have lived all my life at the intersection of people from different cultures trying to get along. And I will tell you, a sign is of limited power. So one of the things that, I have a thermostat in another one of the buildings that these groups always use. I'm probably going to put in an internet thermostat and one of those little hard boxes over it. That means they can't tweak it. Because every time, right now, this time of year is nice because it's not too hot, not too cold. But when winter comes along, the Nigerians like it hot. And so they take that thermostat and they put it all the way up to the top. And even though I tell them, a thermostat is basically a switch. It's on or off. Even if you put it all the way up to 95, the room will not get hotter faster because it's just on. And in the summer, when you want it to get cool, even if you put it all the way down to 55, the room will not get colder any quicker. And in fact, it will definitely not perform very well because I've noticed you've opened all the doors and all the windows to cool the place down, even though it's 105 outside. And please, when you leave, can you turn it off? But every Sunday afternoon, I come back to church to make sure they've turned off the thermostat, and often they haven't. Because if I don't do that, or if I'm away on an estuary trip and I come back a week later and I walk in that room and you can store meat in that room, and then the deacons say, why was our electricity bill so high this month? In other words, oikonomia, family. Now, I really liked when, Ross Bird was talking about, I like his parish manifesto. I like talking about, economics, relationships. And this is all what Jordan is talking about. And they are talking about bringing things down to scale. I've got books. Here's a book. Where Do We Go From Here? A Guidebook for Cell Group Church by Ralph Neighbor Jr. You got a little bookmark in there still. And basically, this book, written, let's see, what's the copyright? 1990, Ralph Neighbor Jr. You have the boomer church. And what happened, the boomer, you get the big box mega church, and then they're working cell groups. And then you begin to realize, holy cow, you know how much money we have to raise in order to put up that sanctuary that can seat thousands of people and have all those classrooms, et cetera, et cetera? It'd be better if we just met in homes, life on life. So in 1991, in our Sacramento cluster, Granite Springs was planted. And Kevin Adams, you can find his rando on my channel, Kevin Adams was the church planter. He used to cut Bill Hybels' mother's lawn when he was a teenager growing up in Kalamazoo, Michigan. And he took that Bill Hybels model, that prevailing church model, and he used it in the suburbs of Sacramento, and he planted Granite Springs Church. Lovely church. And they had communion on Wednesday night once a month, because the Sunday service was the seeker service. This is what was a safe place to introduce a dangerous message to unchurched people, to make them church people. Second church we planted in Sacramento, River Rock. River Rock wasn't going to have a big service, even though I really want to get Tim on. He's another friend of mine who's pastoring in Western Michigan now. Tim had all these great stage skills. Tim is beautiful. He's charismatic. He's brilliant. He's articulate. He's a wonderful musician, sings beautifully, has all those great stage presence. But Tim really wanted to plant a cell church. And so he and Chuck worked on Christian formation. And they were multiplying their groups, and they were multiplying their leaders, and they were doing all that. And the more they did it up there in Folsom, people were like, okay, we got the life on life, we've got the discipleship, we've got the formation, we've got the communion, we've got all of these things. When is church going to start? And as much as Tim and Chuck tried to tell them, no. What's happening in your formation group, that's the real church. That's the communion. And they're right. And everybody said, no, but real church is like when we all get together and we sing and we hear a great sermon and all our kids are together. What does that sound like? Well, everybody's sort of homeschooling in their home, but you know what they really like to do? They like to get together, because then there's specialization, because once those, when the kids are in lower end elementary, everybody can kind of do things. But when they get they're starting to get into calculus and algebra and some of these things, boy, there's somebody in our network who is really good at math. Maybe, and he's really good with kids. Maybe he can explain the math and he can help out. So the same dynamic happening with the homeschooling is happening with the church. And finally, it became such an issue for all the little cells that, okay, first they did some celebration services where they rented a facility, they rented a hotel room, and they got together, and they were all there together, and everybody's like, it's so great being together. I love it when we're all together, because when we love our life on life groups, because then we get to know each other. But there's some people over there that I really like too, and it's nice seeing them every now and then. There's some people over there that I like, and it's nice seeing them every night. So when we all get together, I can get to see those people. Then we got to rent the hotel room. And then we have to figure out what to do with the kids, because the kids get antsy. Now in the CRC, again, I can tell CRC stories about this stuff all day long. And eventually all right, so we're going to start having monthly gatherings. Oh, that's wonderful. And they did every month. And it was like, this is really good. And then, but maybe we should do it every week. And what happens is you just keep reinventing the institution. And so, God bless New Christians on YouTube. Because every time that institution is reinvented, now you can reinvent it under the Orthodox, and you can reinvent it under the Catholics. Because if you look at an Orthodox megachurch, boy, in some ways that has nothing on what Catholics have known how to do. You look at those priests that can do the rosary or the Hail Mary, that just bang, 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 bang. I remember when I was in Ireland and I was staying with the Dominican friars, it was so cool. I loved staying with those men. I love those men. They are awesome. To pray before a meal, I never heard anybody could pray so fast. It's like, whoom. And it was a set prayer. Just, boy, he prayed fast. So would you rather have a set prayer or spontaneous prayer? And you probably some will want some of both. And then when you've got all these little groups, you begin to notice spiritual gifts. And some people are really specialized. And so we've got a house church here and a house church there and a house church there and a house church there. But you know, the leader of this house church, he's really good. He really knows how to talk. He really uses the Bible well. He really is a good teacher. So suddenly, one person's house church starts to grow because it's fruitful and it's multiplying. And then you have a choice to make. Are you going to keep people out of that house church? Or are you going to say, I wonder if there's a bigger room that we could use somewhere? You know, that Livingstone's church, they don't seem to have a lot of cars in their parking lot. I wonder if they've got a room that they would let us use. Remember when the Nigerians came in? There was another Anglican church that had been letting them use a room, and they came in and they're like, we want to use a room. I said, great. It's going to be $400 a month. The other group didn't charge us. Okay. It's still going to be $400 a month. Well, why? Because I already know you're going to run that AC unit that is 30, 40 years old in that building, that I am in terror that one day it's going to go out. You are going to run that unit like nobody's business. I know you will. No, Pastor, we promise we won't. I know you mean it. I know you're sincere. But I also know you will. Because that's just being human. And I don't hold it against you. I might get a little annoyed by it. And every Sunday afternoon when I tell my wife I'm going to run down to church and I'm going to make sure that AC unit is off. In fact, I've got my Sunday afternoon janitor now trained to check it, but he doesn't always make it. So when I'm done with this video, I probably have to go over there and make sure that it is in fact off. Before, in fact, I put that little internet, because last week I just made sure that all the buildings had internet access, because when I start renting to 2 churches, that's double the number of doors that need to be checked, and double the number of little crises, and double the number of phone calls of, Pastor, we have someone from our network coming in from out of town this weekend, and so we want to do a service on Saturday. Can we do the service on Saturday? Yep. How will we get in? I'll come down and open. What time should I meet you? Oh, we'll be there at 8 o'clock. I'm thinking, they're not a time-conscious culture. They'll be here somewhere between 8 and 10. But I better be here at 8 o'clock, because if they get here at 8 o'clock and I'm not here, they're going to call me and say, didn't we agree to be here at 8 o'clock? Yeah, we did. So I'll be here at 8 o'clock. Whether or not it's my day off. And I will wait. And I will wait. And I will wait until they come. Sometimes I'll be here an hour or so, and they'll call and say, "Oh, the meeting was off." Okay. And then I'll go home. And then my wife will say, "Did they come?" And I'll say, "No." And then she'll say something like, "Well, you should tell them they should really be there at 8. Shall I put up a sign? Or don't rent to them anymore. We had this one group from Tonga who they're a pretty good sized church. I really liked the leader. He was a cool guy. We used to sit down in my office, tell lots of stories back and forth. Really liked him. The one thing that they just didn't really do was pay any rent. And the deacons are like, "Pastor, where's the rent from the Tongans?" I'll ask him again. "Oh, yeah. We'll pay. We'll catch up." They rented him for about 8 months. I don't think we got any rent out of him. Now, someone who's into order will say, "Well, why don't you get first and last month's rent right at the beginning?" Yeah, that'd probably be a good idea. Do I always do it? Often I don't. Do I mind that see, the thing is, I watched my father do this. And I've watched all of these things over the years. And Jordan Hall coming into that church, and he's got his house church. That's the real church. And my River Rock guys, if they had Jordan Hall in their house church, they would have loved him to death. Because they'd be like, "Finally, someone who really gets what we're trying to do here." And the other 150 or 200 people who were waiting for the real church to start didn't. So in Northside Chapel in Patterson, the neighborhood was burning down because all of the landlords, the houses, these old houses, they just, as rental properties, they just didn't make any sense. And so at a certain point in the 70s, a lot of these landlords were just burning down their houses and getting the insurance money. And so Patterson was starting to look like a field. You've seen same thing happen in the Bronx during that period. And you just see all this empty land in a place that had been all of these upstairs, downstairs, 2 apartment houses, just row after row, street after street of these things built in the late 19th, early 20th century during the mill days before the automobile really got going. And they were all burning down. And so my father heard about Habitat for Humanity and thought, this is exactly what we need. And so they, sweat equity. They mobilized the Christian Reformed Church Network, Kukin Lumber, who was a place that I worked summers. You can find them in New Jersey. Kukin Lumber gave sacrificially, and people came and they helped build houses. It's amazing, amazing, amazing program of Habitat for Humanity. And often it was church people that got into these houses, people who had been renting crappy places, and now they had a house to buy, they had a house to own. The church itself didn't necessarily thrive from this. Well, why not? Well, you have changes in church leadership, all the constraints, all the peculiarities. That's why getting almost anything done in this world is incredibly hard. And talking about almost everything in this world is incredibly easy. And I'm not saying anything against all these people because I love them to death. But that's why I say, God bless new Christians on YouTube, because I want Paul Kingsnorth to battle against the machine. And I want Jordan Hall and Ross Bird to pursue the Parish Manifesto. And I want Andy Crawford to revolutionize education. When I listen to Andy talk, I can think of how many conversations my wife and I have had over the years about Gato. You can look him up in terms of education. I've got books about church education. I've got books about preaching. I've got books about cell church. I've got books about... This is how the church engages the constraints of the world. And YouTube is now sort of the newest area in which we do it. So God bless new Christians on YouTube. That's enough of this.